Hi, this is Frank Schaeffer, and I would like to explore how the American culture wars of the last 50 years has impacted our foreign policy to the point where we are now abandoning Ukraine. And in fact, Donald Trump is siding with Vladimir Putin. Yes, these two things have something to do with each other. Let me start with an author and a book that she wrote. Her name is Dr. Kristina Stoeckl, and she wrote a book called The Moralist International, Russia in the Global Culture Wars. Now, I interviewed her on my podcast, In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and her very well-researched and documented book that she co-authored with someone who since has had to hide from Vladimir Putin because of Putin's habit of murdering people who stand up against him, is an insight into something that most Americans don't know about. And that is that evangelical Christians on the religious right, of which I was a part, and in fact, a leading figure in the 70s and the 1980s with my late father, Francis Schaeffer, who with C. Everett Koop helped found the evangelical version of the anti-abortion movement with their project and film series that I produced and directed called Whatever Happened to the Human Race. And then Dr. Koop went on and became Surgeon General. Well, from that time on in the late 1970s, my father was a hero to the religious right, to people like Dr. James Dobson, who started a program called Focus on the Family. What you probably didn't know is that as early as the 1990s, Dr. Dobson was taking trips to Russia to meet with Orthodox church leaders that he was trying to involve in the American culture wars against abortion, against gay rights, and all the rest. Dr. Stoeckl outlines in her book the influence that evangelical Christianity, right-wing Christianity, had on the Russian church, and the way that Vladimir Putin then picked up the themes of the American culture wars and folded them into his bid to justify his tyranny, his oppression, his dictatorship, his war on Ukraine later, as a war against liberal values, the culture war carried into a military context, where he talked about, for instance, the fact that in Ukraine, gay rights were a thing, and talked about the fact that he was standing up for Christian values. In fact, Archbishop Kirill of Moscow has backed Putin's attacks on Ukraine as somehow a pushback against Western decadence. This has been the excuse. Enter people like Tucker Carlson and J.D. Vance and others, converts to Roman Catholicism, not converts to Roman Catholicism as most Roman Catholics know it, but to the hard right version that has sponsored things like Donald Trump's presidency and now has infused it with the Project 2025 writings of far-right figures in Roman Catholic organizations like Opus Dei. Now, pause right there, and you'll think that, oh, here's a typical progressive lamenting the fact that the culture war was bent by Donald Trump as it had been formed by evangelical Christians. Here's this man with no family values cashing in, very similar to some of the other people now working for him, like Elon Musk, who has reputedly 13 children by many, many different women, et cetera, et cetera. How can this be evangelical siding with people who contradict all their pro-family values, their traditional Christian morality, et cetera? But that is not my theme today. I'm going to go in a different direction and talk about the fact that a lot of the culture war is the fault of progressives like myself, who since 1947, when they uncritically accepted Kinsey's report on sexuality and started pushing back against what they thought of as traditional Christian morality, since that time have been on the side of a kind of a deconstruction of our culture when it came to social, sexual, cultural values. Now, often progressives look at the right wing and they say these are intolerant fascists. And I would just remind you that that right wing polled very favorably until quite recently on not just gay rights, but gay marriage. And so the right wing, the conservatives, even including evangelicals and Roman Catholics, have lent themselves to a progressive toleration in this culture when it has come to race, sexuality, and other things, which means they are not a kind of watertight group of people that always push back against the idea of liberal values. That said, when it came to the Kinsey report from 1947 on, that a lot of people in academia, the academic left, the tenured left, the elite left, the big Ivy League colleges, et cetera, the media, the gatekeepers, the Washington Post, the New York Times, and others always seemed to side with pushing back against traditional sexual morality. So, for instance, they covered a lot of ground in making people like Hefner and Playboy somehow cool and okay. And then it turns out Hefner's giving Quaaludes and other drugs to young women and passing them off to people like Jim Belushi from Saturday Night Live and others who are having sex with girls who are drugged out of their minds, that it becomes a very ugly thing. And then we just sort of move on and pretend that never happened. Or Johnny Carson constantly making jokes about divorce, not mentioning the fact that women were crashing into poverty when people were getting divorced in the 1970s and the 1980s, and basically threatening, quote unquote, traditional family values. It isn't that the left never questions these things. For instance, the New York Times a while back had a long article on the fact that Kinsey was a con artist, and not only that, a pedophile, that he and his associates were masturbating children as young as 13 and 14 and 18 months old to prove their points about sexuality, that he was dealing with pedophiles all over the country trying to justify his own behavior. And that a lot of the findings of the so-called Kinsey report have found to have been spurious and overstated, to say the least, since. And so there's a little bit of backpedaling. But the fact of the matter is, as someone raised in an evangelical background who left it, as you know, if you've read my memoir, Crazy for God, and my other books, nevertheless, it is not just the right that has trolled the left has trolled the right, and nowhere more than on sexual values. Now, what I'm talking about when I say trolling is not standing up for individual liberties and the right to make our own sexual choices, but somehow throwing into the face of right-wing people things that the left, wink, wink, nod, nod, knows will enrage them. Whether it is people in drag doing children's story hour or things like that, that are just simply provocations and used as a provocation, as if somehow the left knows better and the right should just get used to this. But you know, I came up with a phrase a while back that I guess has sort of stuck in my mind, and that is, you can only deconstruct a culture once. And after that, you're just watching the rubble bounce. And then, of course, people like Tucker Carlson, this opportunist, who is not stupid, but very clever, Harvard educated, et cetera, comes in and uses this kind of resentment of the culture wars, this resentment of constantly being attacked on ideas of there being two sexes and gender being something fixed that is not assigned at birth, but is biologically a reality. Basic things that people took for granted for years have been picked up by people like Tucker Carlson, J.D. Vance, and Donald Trump, and used nefariously to garner votes from people that they don't care about, that they don't really represent. It is a tactic. It is fake all the way down. And the people who are leading the charge don't have a personal values that they hold forth to be mirrored, as in imitating Donald Trump or imitating Elon Musk, but nevertheless use these things as tactics. It's a dirty game. Fast forward to the Ukraine and the war that they have fought against Russia, bravely led by Zelensky, who is a hero and recognized as such globally, someone standing a true David against Goliath, as the Russian troops have raped their way across his country, have bombed hospitals and schools, have had a policy of torturing prisoners and killing them, have used North Korean troops as cannon fodder, this ugly war. And all of a sudden, Donald Trump has switched sides, and he is justifying this on the basis that, what? On the basis that somehow Vladimir Putin represents traditional values. It's the same game being played on an international scale. And so where we are today is understanding that our stupidity, and I mean our stupidity, the left, the progressives, and the right-wing Christians that decided to have this battle about culture wars and sexuality for 50, 60 years, more than that, almost 70 years, more than that, since people like Kinsey came along and told a lie. And Kinsey's lie was this: traditional morality is a construct of Christianity or religion. It's false. It has no bearing in evolution and history. That is not true. If you read a book called The Old Way, which is an incredible story of the indigenous people of the Kalahari, told by someone who lived with them in the 1950s, Elizabeth Marshall Thomas, in her book, The Old Way. If you read that book, you will find that, quote unquote, traditional morality has nothing to do with Christianity. These people had lived in the Kalahari for almost 100,000 years, and very little had changed about them. And she lived with them, with their parents in the 1950s, and discovered that actually they got married. They were faithful to their wives. Yes, there were a few people who had polygamy, but maybe 2 wives, but it was rare. They stuck together as a group. Women shared work with men. Men were into childcare, by the way, as well as being hunters. And in fact, everything that we equate with sort of a traditional moral construct is actually part of human evolution and has nothing to do with the imposition of fake and false morality by Christianity and other religions, as people like Kinsey made out, as if he was liberating us to be permissive. And sure, even today, the New York Times will run pieces on polyamory or some thing that they think is new and comes up with, and they're going to liberate us from the construct. They had an article a couple of weeks ago about a woman who had gotten divorced and now she's having the best sex of her lives. And it's like, we've heard all this before. You can only deconstruct a culture once. But as I was involved in the 1970s and the 1980s on the other side of the issue as a quote unquote pro-life activist, what I learned was that the left is not interested in facts any more than the right is. And we've seen that very much in some of our gender wars and the pronouns and all this nonsense being shoved down our throats, not by trans people, but by a few select elitist trans activists in key organizations like the ACLU or various universities that have made this a kind of a war once again to liberate us from traditional values. Well, the pushback has come. And basically, we on the left have lost the culture war. We've lost it. Roe v. Wade was reversed. The right of women to have abortion is being taken away and attacked. Project 2025 is now writing the laws. Elon Musk is deconstructing the agencies that were basically infiltrated, he says, by these sort of new values. And there's a little irony there because, of course, Elon Musk having many children with many women is the epitome of the post-Kinsey world of sexual morality. We think he's a hero of the right wing. He shows up with a chainsaw at CPAC, says we're going to cut the federal government down. But if you want to know where the original bitterness comes from, it's from the left trolling the right on gender and sexual morality and telling conservative, ordinary people, not necessarily right-wing reactionaries, not necessarily Trump voters, that somehow their values that they got from their parents and their parents' parents that go all the way back into prehistory, long before Jesus was born, long before there were religions, long before there was writing, people were falling in love, living together, having babies, caring for them, as we see in the book, The Old Way, or as we see in the development of the way people learn to practice gynecology to save women in this book I did by Kat Bohannon called Eve, which is on female evolution. And in that evolution, you see exactly the kind of sexual definitions and the fact of women being procreators and all these other things that stupid people like Kinsey said were all to do with attributes of Christianity. They weren't. It's part of evolution. So really, there's 2 things going on here. There's a pushback against evolutionary reality by the right wing and the left wing, and they've created a culture war because we can't agree anymore on what the basic substance of being a human is. And the activists on the left and right are basically trolling each other at the rest of our expense. And then what happened? The internet happened, and we got our phones. And these greedy pigs in the tech bro community rewrote algorithms to keep us all angry at each other. So angry that we now have a political party in the Republican Party and the MAGA people going along with a president who is literally denying the defense of our own country against a country that aims thousands of nuclear weapons at us and that has raped its way across Ukraine. And we've turned everything on its head. And suddenly Zelensky is a dictator and not Trump and not Musk and not Vladimir Putin or Archbishop Kirill, who has justified the rape of an entire country and the bombing of hospitals and preschool daycare centers on the basis that he was defending Christian values. My dear American friends, we made this bed. if you are on the left and part of the progressive movement, you have contributed to this by trolling the right and mocking them for their traditional quote unquote morality that actually goes back to prehistory of the hunter-gatherers and has nothing to do with Jesus or anybody else. And if you are on the left and you have not considered the fact that the sexual revolution has ended in a sordid whimper where Gen Z isn't even dating, let alone cohabitating, let alone having babies, and our demography is crashing as people are not having families, all I'd ask is, hey, sexual revolution, how did that work out for you? But when I look at the right and I say that you have denied the Western alliance that defeated Hitler and stood against Stalin for 75 years in Europe after the World War II, and basically used our military to stop the expansion of Russia, and now suddenly we're switching sides. You have to go back to what Dr. Kristina Stoeckl wrote about, and I urge you to listen to my interview with her on my podcast, In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, about her book, The Moralist International, Russia and the Global Culture Wars. It is an eye-opener. It's an eye-opener because did you know that evangelical Christians, like Dr. Dobson and others, have been working with Russian leaders in the church to get Russia on board with our culture war? It was the other way around. We got them into this, and now they're using it against the West by saying we represent traditional morality, and they are conning the world into thinking they are traditionalists. This person who poisons political opponents, this person whose troops raped with impunity as they marched across Ukraine, and has lost this war and would only, quote, win if Donald Trump hands him the win, because people like Tucker Carlson are urging him to do this as part of our goddamn culture war. So I want to say this. What have we done? My name is Frank Schaeffer.